what I try to discuss is, of course, the birth of social theory in Europe, and many of the very good things about it, but also its limitations, especially when you think about 21st century for East Asia. And I focus largely on its Eurocentric construction, and to apply it would be a serious mistake. Yet, if we reject borrowing social theory outright to make sense of 21st century East Asia, or for that matter, US, then one must come up with an alternative framework. And as I've said, there are other people who believe that you could create a brand new theory, be it game theory or evolutionary psychology, or believe that we can dispense with theory altogether and engage in naive empiricism. And I try to argue why those two approaches are not viable either. Yet if we look within East Asia, by and large, the most potent discourse is that of nativism or nationalism. And I try to argue that it's in part a Eurocentric construct because the very conception of the nation really emerges from the West. And though the contents, of course, are Asian or Taiwanese or Japanese, by and large, they are problematic constructs, largely in part because they cannot draw on their native tradition of philosophy or thinking about social life. So I tried to argue somewhat briefly that nationalism or nationalist discourse doesn't serve us very well either. Provides us with a very misleading understanding of what is happening in various parts, not just of East Asia, but of course the rest of the world. Finally, you might say, why shouldn't we be happy just with the social sciences available in many universities around the world, including, of course, NTU, that economics, political science, sociology, psychology, geography, history, and so on provide a great body of empirical findings, of course, but they too fall prey to some of the problems I pointed out about social theory. And I want now, though, to talk about one institutional precondition of why the social sciences are deeply problematic as they are practiced either here or elsewhere. My simple answer is that the very institution of the modern university, of which National Taiwan University, for example, is one, is actually deeply flawed in its conception, not always, of course, in its execution. The university, by and large, has become the central institution, not just for education, educating the elites of tomorrow. If you look through the major state bureaucracies, economic organizations, cultural institutions, it is very hard to find anyone who does not have a highly credentialed degree, usually from a leading university here or elsewhere. More importantly, in terms of knowledge creation and dissemination, the university plays a central role. Whether we think about innovations in science and engineering, or the leading theories, concepts, findings in social life, we usually find that the origin of many of these ideas and data are right here at the modern research university. And what is most striking about the modern university is that it threatens to become kind of a monopoly of all knowledge and even cultural production and dissemination. The famous German philosopher Jürgen Habermas wrote in his first published book, The Structural Transformation of the Sphere, that if you try to find the origins of European Enlightenment, one can look for it in various institutions that sprung up throughout much of Europe. Things seemingly simple like coffee shops, whereby people could gather, exchange information and ideas debate their positions and create a sphere that was independent of the monarchy, the state, and other institutions like the church that dominated people's way of thinking. And the public sphere, of course, promises a potentially open and democratic arena, whereby people can come together, exchange ideas and information, and thereby create new ones. And this can, of course, happen not just in tea houses and coffee shops, but also through media like the radio, magazines, newspaper, the internet. And yet, by and large, the ideas that disseminate in these institutions of the public sphere are increasingly derived from those generated within the confines of university campuses. And so to better understand this very powerful institution of knowledge production in the 21st century, what I'm proposing to do today is to look backward at the history of Western University and how a particular conception of the modern university came to dominate, first in the US and then eventually around the world. Of course, it's kind of a truism that every civilization had some form of higher education. That is, where the elite, intellectual elites learned the trade, of course, of various professions, debated philosophical ideas, read classical philosophical texts, and so on and on. So it's true if we go back to India, and Jews in the Middle East, academies in Confucian academies in China, almost everywhere you have some form of higher education. But the university as we know it today sprang largely from the model that was initially established in 12th century Europe, largely in Italy, France, and England. Now, if you go back further, of course, many of the great conceptions, practices, were actually Arabic or Islamic in origin. So many of the practices that we still do today, so for example, when one becomes a professor, we talk about how she or he has a chair, right? A chair in sociology, social theory, or whatever. That idea actually comes from Arabic institutions. Even the idea of wearing a gown, caps and gown, is actually Arabic and Islamic in origin. But nonetheless, we have forgotten this and believe that the Western University arises pretty much in the 12th century in Bologna, Paris, Oxford, and so on. Now, this medieval university, of course, is radically different from the sort of institutions we find today at NTU, for example. People did not do research as we know it. What people did instead was primarily to teach, and by teaching, most people were simply lecturing by reading from classical texts. You have to remember this is before the printing press, much less the internet, and books had to be laboriously written by hand by professional scribes, and they're very expensive. Even if you look at the studies, so to speak, we don't really know, but we have paintings. And so if you look at the great medieval monks and scholars, they usually have about 4 or 5 books. That's all they have. I know we don't read books anymore, but you probably have more than 5 books right there in your laptop. And certainly you have access to millions more through the internet, through university libraries and so on. Be that as may, what people did was largely to read these classical texts. So if I were lecturing in Paris, or Bologna, or Oxford 800 years ago, I would be reading from some philosophical text. And then you would be busily copying them down. And of course, I would occasionally give commentaries, because it's very hard to say what they actually meant. And of course, students would later be asked to engage in questions and answers, like we do today, and finally disputations, debates. But the form of knowledge that was disseminated, of course, was deeply circumscribed. By which I mean simply that the dominant institution in medieval Europe was not the university. It was actually the monarchy and the church. The monarchy actually didn't care what people really thought very much, but the church did. So the church, in many ways, limited expressions of free thought. So if you went outside of the boundary, I mean, I joked last time about if I were saying certain nasty things about Taiwan or Republic of China 40 years ago, perhaps Chiang Kai-shek and his henchmen would come and throw me in jail. Well, if you said nasty things about the truth of the Catholic Church, you could potentially be threatened to be burned alive at stake, as many people were. It takes courage to be truthful. Today it's very easy, actually, just the same way. No one knows who you are. What's interesting about medieval university, however, is that in spite of the seeming parochialism, it was actually quite cosmopolitan. By and large, I think if you take classes at NTU even today, 95%, perhaps close to 100% of students are Taiwanese. I mean, of course, they're always foreign students. But in the universities in Paris, Bologna, and Oxford, the student body was very cosmopolitan. They came from all over Europe. And one of the reasons this could happen very easily was that the language of learning was not, there was only one language of learning. If you knew Latin, you had access to almost everything. Of course, if you truly learned it, you would then learn Greek, Hebrew perhaps. But by and large, Latin got you everywhere. And so many of the great philosophers, from St. Augustine on, was really only fluent in Latin, but that was enough to establish not only his capacity to read all the major works, including Greek philosophy and so on, but also to write books that can be disseminated across the civilized world. As you know, this had a parallel case in China, for example, where if you knew classical Chinese, you could go from Japan all the way, basically, to the borders of India and not have trouble having people understand you, or at least some people understand you. And this is, of course, returning once again with the rise of English as lingua franca of the academic world. Because so many things are translated to English, English offers now, for better or worse, singular access to the world of learning in science and engineering. I think many of your textbooks in NTU are probably in English. There's not even a point in translating. The ideal figure in this university was, of course, a monk who dedicated his life, was single-sex by and large, to the world of learning. And if you should like sleep with your students, it could be castrated and things like that. Today you just get fired. One time ago you got castrated. Not very good. Anyway, so this medieval idea of the university survived for a long time. And though it changed a great deal in the 600-year period to 19th century, by and large, the dominant idea was that expressed by Cardinal Newman in his book, The Idea of the University in 1889. His definition of university was a place to teach universal knowledge. Meaning university was simply a tertiary education. You go to what we call high school, and you go to university. It's a place really just for teaching. And in 18th century or even 16th century, place where you do research is not the university, but academies. There were separate institutions that engaged simply in the act of research. So in Taiwan, for example, you have Academia Sinica, which is supposed to be for research. They're researchers. NTU, at least in its original conception, was largely a teaching institution. But by 20th century, and certainly late 20th century, the idea that came to supersede, overtake, and really become the dominant idea of the university is the idea proposed by Clark Kerr in his book. Essentially, he was trying to argue that we no longer have this university, but multiversity that does many different things. And it's not a place to teach, but effectively what he called a social service station. By social service station, what he meant really was that it does many different things. And I'll elaborate on this. The forerunner of multiversity, of course, is the research university. And it has a very particular birthday. The philosopher Wilhelm von Humboldt proposed and was instrumental in creating the first research university building at the University of Berlin in 1810. And what made the University of Berlin very different from all the other universities in Europe was the simple idea that university existed as a place to create knowledge. That is to say, whereas academies provided research until then, now the university was supposed to do research. And in this endeavor, von Humboldt stressed the importance of theory and methodology because that's what separates Wissenschaft. It's usually translated science, but it really means any field of knowledge, systematic knowledge. And to achieve the systematic knowledge, you need theory and method. And third and most importantly, which I didn't put here, he tried to argue that the real purpose of the university was not to train professionals. I forgot to stress that the medieval university really was a place to teach, but teach professionals, meaning vocations or occupations like divinity, people who wanted to become priests, lawyers, and doctors. Von Humboldt's conception was that although those will remain within the university, the real heart and the brain of the university was to create knowledge in the liberal arts, which included natural sciences, humanities, and so on. And to achieve this, he stressed the importance of freedom, academic freedom, both the freedom to teach and the freedom to learn. So you are no longer a student simply being given classics and canon, but you are given freedom to choose what you hope and wish to study. Which is why you can now choose majors, choose courses. And this, though seems so obvious now, was completely radical and revolutionary in 19th century Europe. Until then, people took the same courses, by and large. There are a couple other things I want to mention. One is that this research university became less cosmopolitan, in part because the university became entwined with the modern state. Berlin was, of course, the capital of Prussia, which then, of course, eventually becomes Germany. And one of the reasons to create the university becomes a reason to create the modern state. And in so doing, the student body becomes primarily national. The Prussian University of Berlin was really supposed to educate Prussian leaders, elites. And this is the idea that's inherited by Japanese. When they created the University of Tokyo, for example, the idea was to train the elites within Japan, and this gets transplanted to its colonies, Korea, Taiwan, and elsewhere. And finally, the ideal of this was actually the idea of, using German words now, Bildung, which was to cultivate yourself. And cultivate yourself in, again, a German word, Beruf, meaning simply your calling. So you're supposed to engage in learning because you have some true interest in a particular vocation or body of knowledge, and this is a form to cultivate you as a learned person, and in so doing, you also serve the nation of which you are part. And the conflation, or the close relationship between the individual college graduates and the state should be obvious, because increasingly the leaders of these modern nation states are drawn from the leading universities. That becomes one of the reasons why people want to go, and becomes one of the justifications for supporting this sort of university. Now, the European idea gets transplanted to the US. And by 1945, at the end of World War II, Americans really began to become the true dominant power, at least in Europe and Asia. And they transformed, in many ways, the idea of the modern research university. In theory, it's still the same. People believe in knowledge creation, people believe in academic freedom, people believe in the importance of personal cultivation and nation building. But in fact, the practice of the modern research university in the US was radically different in practice. And this is true in at least two fundamental ways. One is that rather than theory, or even method, the stress comes to be on pragmatic things, meaning trying to apply knowledge, and apply knowledge especially in professions ranging from engineering, medicine, law, to social welfare, education, what have you. Secondly, in contrast to the European university, modern American research university becomes very large and very differentiated. Just to give you an example, even if you go to a German university today, very often a particular field of inquiry, say sociology, would have 1, 2, 3 professors. Whereas in modern American research universities, it's very common to have 30, 35, or even 40 professors. American research universities are just larger. But they're not just larger, they began to differentiate very rapidly in the sense of creating new disciplines. So if you look at sociology, for example, not so long ago, there was just sociology. But from sociology, in many American universities today, you see many disciplines or fields that spun out in the course of the last 30 to 50 years. Everything from departments of ethnic studies, African American studies, gender and women's studies, gerontology programs, very often criminology programs, and so on and on. These all become differentiated and over time independent and autonomous. The third and final element, which is hard to see, is that universities begin to have multitude of functions. If you go to European university today, it's still basically just a place to teach. If you go to most American universities, it has many things. And I'll talk more about this in a bit. Now, this idea of American university was most eloquently summarized by Clark Kerr, who was the first president of the University of California. Essentially, what he tried to argue was that the university is no longer a singular entity, but it does just many, many different things. And so, of course, you continue to teach, you provide credentials, but you also provide a lot more. So if you come to this university and go through the front gate, you see at the end of this Grand Pond Drive, or whatever it's called, a big university. And this is common everywhere. Major research universities have huge libraries. But modern multiversity not only has libraries, but also labs, but also teach everything from creative writing, studio art, they have museums, they have field stations, they have symphonies, they have psychological help clinics, and so on and on. And so increasingly, university becomes a place not just to teach and research, but also a place to engage in sports, psychological counseling, special needs, and so on. But the primary focus becomes research, especially as it contributes to science and engineering and to the functioning of the state, especially the welfare state. What becomes valuable and valorized are innovations. So if you look at Berkeley, for example, why is it relatively famous? Well, one of the reasons I think was that it was central to creating the atomic bomb, it was very central to creating laser, two things which, it's good and bad, obviously, at some level, but without which we can't really think about the 20th century. And in this pursuit, truth becomes really completely unbound. You try to look for truth everywhere, which is why we find in the modern research university every conceivable path of inquiry. We don't just study philosophy and physics, but we study film, we study art practice, and we study social welfare. We learn how to teach, education school that produces teachers, and so on and on. The university also becomes increasingly international because, in part, the idea is to disseminate knowledge beyond the nation. And finally, the ideal of the scholar is no longer that of the medieval monk or someone who wants to cultivate himself, but rather someone who can engage in research and especially engage as sort of a scholar businessman or scholar manager. So kind of an emblematic scientist or scholar in mid-20th century multiversity is J. Robert Oppenheim, who was, of course, the head of the Manhattan Project, which created the atomic bomb, and in many ways is more consequential than Albert Einstein. We all know about Einstein, and by and large, he spent his time just writing on paper, solving equations. Of course, it had a huge impact, but that's the model of the research university that was enshrined in the University of Berlin. You think in your study, and you have these great thoughts. Multiversity has a slightly different image. You have these large research teams, you manage them, get grants, and then you produce knowledge. So if you look at a typical article in Science or Nature, the two leading journals in natural sciences, there are usually multiple authors, sometimes 50. And more importantly, if you actually look at what these people do, you look at what professor of chemistry or professor of electrical engineering do, they're not sitting in their office reading or conducting experiments. They're usually just typing grants or telling people apply for grants. They're just managers. In many ways, they're no different from business people who manage employees. So this US model becomes quite dominant in the US at first, and over time elsewhere. This is because, in part, Americans began to create American-style universities in trying to avoid spread of communism. Americans would build universities in places like Egypt and Turkey. So there are American universities almost everywhere. Second, and more importantly in many ways, it tries to encourage emulation of this American model. So if you look at East Asian universities, especially in Japan, but also Japanese colonies and also China and elsewhere, the real model was actually Germany. So if you went to the University of Tokyo, say in 1940, the main foreign language people learned was German, not English. That's very interesting. I mean, as late as mid-1980s, if you went to a bookstore near University of Tokyo, which served academic clothing